I want to begin our story today with just the prologue. We're going to hear about The Storyteller by Evan Turk. And it begins like this. Long, long ago, like a pearl around a grain of sand, the fertile kingdom of Morocco formed near the great dry Sahara. It had fountains of cool, delicious water to quench the dangerous thirst of the desert, and storytellers to bring the people together. But as the kingdom grew and life became easier, the people forgot their fears of the desert, and soon they forgot the fountains and the storytellers. One by one, the voices of the storytellers were drowned out by noise and silenced by age, and one by one the fountains dried up. As the last fountain dried, far away in the Sahara, a great wind began to stir. This is how our story begins today. It sets the stage, if you will. It lets you know what we're about to go into as a story, that it will be about the struggle between living on the desert's edge and needing water, but it will also be about stories and storytellers. And here's what I can tell you by way of warning. Stories are not only told to entertain us, they also serve to give information, to impart wisdom. And here's my favorite part, they can tell us about ourselves, about our hopes and our fears, about our struggles, and about who we really are. This story will do that if you let it. You might begin by imagining we are living at the desert's edge, that we are living near something large and dangerous. Maybe not a desert exactly, but something that could be harmful if we're not careful. And that there is a resource like water that is usually readily at hand, but lately has been in short supply. I'll leave it to you to ponder what the parallels might be while we listen to the story. As a second warning, I will tell you that this is a story within a story, which also has a couple of extra stories in it. A boy listens to a story from an old storyteller by a dried up fountain. In the storyteller's tale, a young girl listens to a blind woman's story. And in the blind woman's story, there's a young weaver listening to the story of an older weaver who also used to be a princess. And you will see the princess's story is the foundation for the young weaver's story, which in turn leads into what is happening in the blind woman's story, which is what the old storyteller by the fountain has been talking about all along. All that said, this may still end up being a little confusing. So I have asked Jan Fiore and Trebby Johnson and Amanda Jones to help me out. They will take turns telling this tale as it gets to the different layers. And later, when we get to part 2, Nathan Elsner will be joining in the fun. This is The Storyteller by Evan Turk. And as I told you, it says that it began in Morocco, and that as the last fountain dried far away in the Sahara, a great wind began to stir. And at that same moment, in the hot, dry south of the kingdom, a thirsty young boy made his way through the clamor and smoke of the great square to look for a drink. No one had any water to give. Our fountains have run dry, the last water seller said. But here, take one of my brass cups. If you find water, you can drink it and share it with others. And as the boy walked home, a voice called out to him, "My boy, are you looking for something to drink?" A withered old man was looked parched, but he was perched on the edge of a dry fountain. "That fountain doesn't have any water," the boy said. The man's face cracked with a smile like dry mud to reveal a toothless grin. "Sit down, my boy, and your thirst shall be quenched." And the old man's voice rumbled like a spring from deep within the earth and began.
Not long ago, there was a terrible drought in the nearby villages. All the rivers and streams ran dry. Yet one family always had enough, and they shared with anyone who asked. At first, the neighbors were grateful, but soon they became suspicious and greedy. One cunning neighbor decided to sneak her young daughter into the family's house to learn their secret. There she met a blind woman. Pretending to be the woman's granddaughter, she asked in her sweetest voice, "Won't you please tell me why we have water?"
Blind woman laughed a gravelly laugh. "Our family has never been in want of water, thanks to the great blue bird that lives in our courtyard. I was given the bird by my mother and she by hers, and so on back 1,000 years. And for 1,000 years, the glittering bird has always flown and found us water, no matter how dry the land becomes." "But where did the bird come from?" The blind woman smiled and replied, "Oh, well, that is a story for another day."
As the old man uttered these words, the boy discovered that his brass cup was full of cool water. He gasped and looked up at the storyteller. "But what about the bird?" he asked. "Come back tomorrow, and I shall tell you the story of the glorious blue water bird." The boy gulped down his water and rushed home.
Far away in the Sahara, the wind swirled into an enormous sandstorm. The next morning, the boy awoke at dawn and ran to meet the storyteller at the fountain again. "Would you like to hear the story of the glorious blue water bird?" the old storyteller asked. The boy nodded, and the storyteller began.
The next day, the little girl snuck in and asked the blind woman again, "Where did the bird come from?"
"Ah, yes. Many years ago, my great-great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother was a carpet weaver. Our village again had a terrible drought, and the people had to travel far to find water. One day, a very old woman walked into the weaver's home with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "My dear, are you thirsty?" she asked. "Oh, my, yes," the weaver replied. "We haven't a drop in our whole village." The old woman smiled and unwrapped her bundle to reveal a spindle of the most beautiful, shimmering blue yarn. "I was once a weaver as well," she said, "but I have grown old and can no longer trust my hands. Please take this yarn and create something for the people to hope for. and I promise your thirst will be quenched. Where did you come by this beautiful yarn? The old woman chuckled and replied, Ah, well, that is a story for another day. And she left.
The old man smiled, and again the boy's brass cup was full of beautiful, clear water. But what about the yarn? That boy asked. Come back tomorrow, and I shall tell you the story of the miraculous yarn. So the boy drank his water and headed home.
And not so far away, in the Sahara, the sandstorm gathered and grew and blocked out the sun. The boy came back the next day, eager to hear the rest of the story. The storyteller cleared his throat, and his voice poured out.
The next day,
the old woman returned to the weaver's home to find her struggling with the yarn. I don't know where to begin, the weaver said. It's as if my mind unravels in front of the loom.
Ah, yes, said the old woman. You must first find hope for yourself before you can weave it for others. Let me tell you the story of this miraculous yarn. When I was young and beautiful, I was a princess, and I was to marry a prince. I did not love him, and so the night before my wedding, I escaped into the desert with only a camel and my life. I wandered across the dunes for so long that I could no longer count the days. I thought myself near death until there appeared what I thought must surely be a mirage. There in the deep valley was a loom and an enormous pile of yarn of every color. I collapsed in the sand and wept in despair. Yet as I stared at the yarn, I noticed a blue glimmer, and I began to hope. I picked up the end of the sparkling yarn you see before you and began to weave it into a carpet of shimmering blue. Within hours, I had woven the finest carpet in the land. I laid it out into the center of the valley and fell asleep. When I awoke, the carpet had turned into a beautiful, clear pool, and I drank until I could take no more. Renewed, I sat in front of the loom and began to weave again. Red clay for a house to keep me safe from sand and wind. Emerald green for a grove of palm trees to give me shade. Bright gold and copper for juicy dates to satisfy my hunger. I kept weaving until I had birthed an entire kingdom. When I was finished, the only yarn left was this spindle of blue, which never seemed to run out.
With tears in her eyes, the carpet weaver smiled at the old woman. She gathered the women of her family together, and in a flurry they began tying knots one by one. The yarn came alive in their fingers, and soon a glorious bird awakened and emerged from the loom. It burst out the door with a buoyant cry and disappeared into the sky. It returned only moments later, carrying buckets of fresh, cool, clear water, which it poured into the well. Again and again it flew until the well overflowed and the village was saved.
the little girl thanked the blind woman for her story. Then she crept out the door to tell her mother, who hatched a plan to steal the bird. Late that night, the mother snuck into the neighbor's courtyard. There she spied the most beautiful creature she had ever seen, glittering like a sapphire in the moonlight. She fell to her knees and wept. The family came out into the courtyard to find their neighbor on the floor. Good morning, neighbor. Why do you weep? And why are you in our home? In greed, I came to steal this bird, but once in its presence, I was filled with hope instead. Reflected in its feathers, I saw myself. The family brought her inside, and they shared a pot of sweet tea with fresh mint as she dried her eyes. No one ever tried to steal the bird again, and the village never again went without water.
And with this, the old man finished, and the boy's brass cup overflowed with water. The boy sipped from it and poured the rest into the fountain. We continue our story. At that moment, the sandstorm arrived at the gate of the city in the form of an enormous djinn. His voice boomed across the trembling walls.
I am the desert, and now that your fountains are gone, I shall destroy your city at sundown and make you part of the desert again.
The boy and the storyteller smiled at each other, and the boy ran to the gate. Oh, mighty Sahara, before you destroy us, let me tell you a tale, and perhaps you will reconsider, he shouted up into the wind.
I have made up my mind, but you may continue, and then I will destroy your city at sundown.
And so the boy began to tell the tale of the endless drought. And the djinn was intrigued and failed to notice the sun setting.
But what about the bird?
It was nearly dark now, and a small circle of people had formed as the boy finished. Ah, the bird. Well, that is a story for another day, he replied. If you spare our city tonight, tomorrow I will tell you the tale of the glorious blue water bird. The djinn agreed and faded into the desert for the night. And the next afternoon, the boy brought together all the water sellers from the square, and he asked them to give a brass cup to anyone who came to listen. And the djinn arrived at the gate and said,
Tell me your tale, and then I will destroy your city at sundown.
The boy began the tale. And as he did, more and more people crowded around, and each one was given a brass cup. The djinn again failed to notice the sun setting as the boy told his story, and by the end, the sun had been down for some time, and the crowd gasped to see their cups full of water.
But what about the yarn?
Ah, well, the boy said, that is a story for another day. If you spare our city tonight, tomorrow I will tell you the story of the miraculous yarn. The djinn yawned and agreed and disappeared back into the desert. The boy then had everyone pour their water into the fountains, and the next day, the entire city circled around the boy to hear his tale, and soon the djinn arrived as well.
Tell me your tale, and then I will destroy your city at sundown.
The boy began. As his voice rose, the great square fell silent. The audience began pouring their cups of water into the fountain, and by the end of the tale, the fountains were gurgling again. The djinn was so entranced that he didn't notice any of this.
What clever stories, my boy. But alas, now I must destroy your city.
But when the sandstorm began to push against the walls, water began to gush from every fountain. The djinn found himself hopelessly overpowered. With one final roar from the crowd, the djinn fell back in defeat, and at last he retreated farther and farther until he was deep in the dunes of the Sahara. So what do you think this story might mean? A good story, of course, will have more than one meaning. Perhaps a better question is, what do you think Douglas wants this story to mean? Why did Douglas choose to tell us this story today? Certainly, there is the obvious answer that this is a story with many little stories embedded that seem to be about the importance of story. So on a Sunday when we are talking about stories, this one seems like a good choice. But there's more to it than that. Let me offer you this. As a blessing, the preacher smiled across the Zoom screen. In this story, with many stories, the desert is a dangerous reality. We have been dealing with this pandemic and its dangerous reality for over a year. We have been struggling and we have suffered. And the important thing to notice after the desert is the role of the water. Water in this story is the resource everyone wants. Water is what helps everyone survive, and it keeps the danger at bay. So what might be the water for us today? If the desert symbolizes the pandemic and its dangers, the water would be the resources we have to keep the danger at bay. Perhaps it's not just the pandemic, but also the consequences of it, such as our loneliness, our fear, our powerlessness, even our losses. The water, then, is hope and connection. Our water is whatever keeps us engaged with the parts of life that help us live more abundantly. It has been many long months. Our wells are growing dry. Impending doom has been at the gates of our cities, howling about destruction, and yet we still tell our stories. We share our memories and our simple joys with each other. We are buoyed by hope. Such stories and memories and connections keep the danger at bay. So, tell your story. Share your message of hope. Reveal to others your connectedness. We still struggle. We still suffer. The storm has not passed. But even now, there is more water among us than we thought we'd had before. Even now, we have what we need, and we will see each other through. That is our story. That is our water. And as an extra bit of spice, I will tell you that there is just a little bit remaining in our story that I will share with you now as an epilogue. As you remember, the sandstorm in the form of the djinn had retreated further and further until he was deep in the dunes of the Sahara. And that, said the young storyteller, is the story of how not long ago a young boy saved Morocco from the desert. And what happened to that boy asked a small girl in the audience. Ah, well, the young man replied with a wink. That is a story for another day.